Okay, Barbara, we are live.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always exciting to welcome a debut author. We get to meet Eva Jurczyk. You get to meet her. And her book, Department of Rare Books and Special Collections, has attracted a lot of commentary, including a review on Sunday from the New York Times, which Eva tells me, well, you tell us, how did it strike you?
Like I said before we went live, maybe the most exciting thing that has ever happened to me. Don't tell the small child in the next room who I birthed, but yeah, cracking the newspaper and seeing that, what a surprise! What a wonderful surprise that was.
Very, very nice. So, Eva, your background, it's always interesting to know, what brought you to write this particular book. What's your professional background, and does that relate to the setting for this book?
Yeah, it does. So I am a librarian right now. I work in the library of a large university. But I'm not a rare book librarian. For a year and a half or so, while I was a graduate student, I worked in the rare books library of that university, and very much as an outsider. The people who work in that type of setting generally have years and years and years of education and know everything about everything and know their trade so deeply. And I sort of stumbled into the job. I pretended to speak some languages that I don't actually speak, and I was hired. I was eventually called on to do work in the Czech language, which became a little bit of a problem. But I digress. And so being an outsider in that setting, I really got to observe the interactions of these deeply passionate people about their work. I got to observe the sort of strangeness of the setting and of that trade, and it just stuck in my brain for a couple of years. I had wanted to be a writer forever since I was very young. And when I thought about putting together something like a mystery, a lot about that place, yeah, it really stuck around, and it seemed like a great place to set a mystery. There's lots of dark corners for doing dark deeds in a place like a rare books library. There's people who have they had some scores to settle after a long time, and of course you're working around these priceless objects. So yeah, that professional background and that time that I got to spend in the rare books library really did ignite the spark that turned into this book.
Well, it's certainly true that when you've got valuable objects like that, you've got opportunities for theft, you've got opportunities for forgery, you've got quarrels over money and what should be spent. Everybody has different priorities, but there's my time in special libraries and rare books was at the Library of Congress. And I can tell you that one of the most stressful things that came along every year was the budget, because the budget has to be approved by Congress. And, there's all the operational budgets. You can't do a whole lot about, buildings and grounds budget, and you have to have money for repair, all the rest of it. So there is no unlimited pocket for purchases, and it can get really cutthroat when people, champion one acquisition over another.
Well, and the thing about the rare books trade is it's not as though you can necessarily budget for what's going to come up in a year, because when a rare book goes up for sale, that's an event, and it's a time limited event. So it's, perhaps somebody who's collected books all their life has died and something going up for auction, or perhaps somebody, is liquidating an estate. So you need to make a decision really quickly if you want something, and you might need to very quickly find hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to acquire this thing. And when you're talking about public institutions or donor funded institutions, that's when you get into sort of the tricky business of how do we quickly find and gather some money to get this thing, which if we don't buy it this month, it's not going to be here if it takes us a year and a half to find the money.
Well, it's entirely true that institutional versus private collecting is, they're really quite different. J.P. Morgan, for example, there was Marie Benedict and another author wrote a biography or a fictionalized life of Belda Costa Green, who was J.P. Morgan's personal library. And, he had all the money there was at the time. And so he was able to buy what he felt like when he felt like it. there was my husband's grandfather, Lessing Rosenwald, was one of the major donors to the Library of Congress. The Rosenwald collection there is amazing. And there's a rare books librarian in Philadelphia that worked very closely with Lessing over the years. I'm trying to remember his name, Rosencrantz, something like that. Can't remember. And so oftentimes private collectors would wind up being in partnership or have advice, from somebody more knowledgeable than them. And so, they were the only person that really ever made a decision about how much money they were going to spend. But it doesn't work like that in institutions. And so I thought you captured that whole problem with acquiring funds, keeping donors happy, people with their different agenda very well. Actually, one of the things that's interesting about the book is the way that institutional politics tend to trump law and order in this book. I mean, is that something, I don't want to, put you on the spot here, but is that something you imagined or is that something you actually encountered?
Well, it's something that I imagined based on, anytime you're putting something in a novel, it's always more extreme than what you encounter in real life. So, you take a look at what was around you and you imagine something maybe 15% more severe than that. But I was actually vindicated because about a year ago, so well after the book was written, it was already, sold and in production. Cambridge University came out and reported that for 20 years, they have known that two major items in their collections, Diaries of Charles Darwin, have been missing, and they now are ready to admit that they were stolen. And for 20 years, this is something that they have been keeping quiet. And they said to themselves, I mean, it's uncanny how similar it is to what's in the book. They said to themselves that perhaps they were just misshelved, and they looked for them for a really long time. And then when they realized they were stolen, they didn't want to go public with that knowledge because, they're meant to be the keepers of these collections. They're imparted with so much trust and with so much money to keep these collections. But then finally, after all this time, I don't know what caused them to finally go public with it. Perhaps there was a change in leadership or something like that. But yeah, they finally came out and went public and said these items have been missing from our collection. We are looking for your help to try to find them. So it really mapped exactly onto what happened in the book, the need to protect the reputation of the institution, trumping what you would think of as law and order. You see this priceless item in your collection goes missing, you would immediately call the police and go for help. But it seems like it's quite a bit more complicated in these institutions.
Well, I think it is more complicated, but of course, unless you're willing to admit that the item is missing, there's really not much you could do to pursue getting it back, whether it's a criminal thing or. And all this is that sometimes people feel a sense of ownership because they work there, even if they don't actually, own it. So there are those questions. If something's missing, one, is it just misfiled? Is it somewhere loose in the library on a shelf? And one of the hallmarks of a library, people don't think about this as often as they should, is that in order for a library to function, you have to be able to find things in it. The retrieval system is actually the key to a successful library. And there have been many systems put in place. Most of you are probably familiar with the Dewey Decimal System. More common today is the Library of Congress system. When I did a summer at Oxford, I learned that the Bodleian Library, for example, still was cataloging by date of acquisition. It was amazing. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but they had, these giant ledgers, and they had little pieces of paper and little glue pots and little spoons, and they would keep gluing in, more stuff. I never did figure out, now it's digitized, I'm sure, but it still wasn't in the mid 80s. And so the word of mouth was that if you really wanted something from the Bodleian, you were better off to drive to Cambridge because you had a better chance of finding the book in the Cambridge Library. So, the Great Library of Alexandria, it was all scrolls. So what system did they have? It burned. when Vesuvius went up and up. But how do they find anything? Was it?
Well, and what's so tough about rare books libraries and these special collections is it's not as though, you walk into a public library there, everything has a sticker on the spine, it's organized, if something's pulled out, you can look at the object, look at the sticker and know where it goes. But it's far more complicated in the special collections because you can't put a sticker on a special item like that. So you just have these little flags or little flyers that get tucked into the book. And then you're counting on the fact that little flag is always going to stay with the book, but obviously they're physically separate. So that's sort of one complicated problem. The idea that they're shelving or organizing things by date of acquisition isn't that unusual at all. At the Fisher where I worked, things are shelved, by date of acquisition, everything gets a number, but they just sort of progressively go on, and by size, because you need the books to help support each other's weight. So all the 12-inch books had to be shelved next to the 12-inch books because that was part of helping them preserve each other. Then, of course, there's no real intellectual organization to these things. They're just sort of by size. So it is feasible that if you misfiled something or something got separated from its flag, it could go missing for a really long time. I mean, that's not impossible.
No, not at all. And the reason that I brought this whole subject up is that this book turns upon, or at least in the opening pages, there has been an acquisition of the Plantain, or do you call it Plantain? How are you doing this?
I'm doing the North American presentation, the Plantain.
Okay. So the Plantain Polyglot Bible has been acquired for, let's say, $500,000 or something like that. And now it's thought to be, well, here's the question. It's not immediately visible. So is it locked up in a safe in the department head's office? Has it been misshelved somewhere in the library? Or worse, has it gone walkabout? And if it went walkabout, does somebody steal it? Does somebody just want to take it home and stroke it? What happened? And then what are they going to do about it when the donors who funded this thing show up? And, they obviously want to see this thing that they have paid for, and it can't be found. Wow, that's a really sort of sickening moment in a career, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that because that moment is so sickening that you can't find the thing, I think that the characters in the book, probably in the way that characters in real life would, are just there's a real sense of denial at first. Like, of course it wasn't stolen. Of course it's here somewhere. Of course we just mislaid it. I think that is with you, it's almost like if you're, let's say you parked your car, sort of a crass metaphor, but you park your car in a mall parking lot and you leave after you finish shopping and you're looking for your car. It's not there and it's not there. You're just going to tell yourself like, oh, I just didn't remember where I parked it. And you're going to keep wandering around that parking lot. And it's going to take you a pretty long time to admit to yourself that car was stolen. And I think that these characters are doing the same thing. Everything's pointing to the fact that this book was probably stolen. Somebody walked out with it, but they just take so long to get there because the idea of that is so unbelievable to them.
Well, they're supposed to be custodians and,
exactly.
To have it go missing on their watch. But one of the things, well, let's talk about Liesel, first of all, because Liesel is the librarian, Liesel Weiss, who's confronted with this mess because the department head, Christopher, has had a stroke and is missing in action when suddenly here comes this thing with the donors who want to look at the book and nobody can find the book. So one option was the safe, right?
Yeah. So the book could have been in the safe, new acquisition, not yet fully insured, would have been in the safe before it went out on the shelves. But Liesel's coming into the story at a time where she didn't really know a lot of what's going on. She thought she would get to go on a leave. She'd been Christopher's second in command for a very long time, had been in some ways doing the job of the leader of the library without necessarily getting the credit for it. Knew that her boss was maybe not always the most responsible guy, was a great figurehead for the library, but if the rule was that they're always supposed to put something in the safe, maybe he wasn't going to do it 100% of the time. So she sort of thrust in the situation where the book is immediately, the volumes are immediately missing. It's immediately her responsibility, but really, it's fair for her to assume that maybe this guy just didn't carry out the steps that he was supposed to carry out in the way that he had often missed those steps, in the way that she was usually the one sort of picking up after him and making sure that things got done properly. So yeah, she's coming into the story really, I think, in a place of vulnerability, having to take responsibility for this, maybe not being given the respect that she's entitled to in this role, that she has to really quickly step into. Yeah, it's a difficult position to be in as a leader.
Well, very hard. And one of the things that immediately strikes you is that she doesn't have the combination to the safe. And, safe cracking part of her skill set, or, how's she going to, can they even look in the safe? So her first instinct is really to basically clean up Christopher's office, right? And try to, and then the library, and hope that somebody, that it got put on a rolling cart or something, to be shelved, and to hope that that's true. How big is this collection? How reasonable is it to think that maybe they could search it to make sure that the Plantin Polyglot Bible isn't sitting on some shelf somewhere?
I mean, it's a big collection. We're probably talking, not quite 1 million volumes, but pretty close. And so on the one hand, it's sort of a two-sided problem. It's a big enough collection that it's feasible that this is what happened to the book, that it got lost. And the reason that we're not immediately seeing it is because it was in the shelved. And if we can just get through checking this collection, then we'll find it. On the other hand, if you're talking about, maybe 750,000 volumes, that's going to take you a long time to manually check those things. The bindings on a lot of these things is not immediately clear what you're looking at. A lot of the items on these shelves might be in boxes for preservation. So it would be a big task, and it would take a very, very long time, but certainly too long from the point of view of the donors who want to see this thing that they funded. But if you were sort of in the state of denial about maybe this is what happened to this book, then I guess a thing that you could tell yourself is that, yes, maybe that's where this book is.
So there's Liesl, can't do the safe cracking thing. Books may be in the safe. Maybe she can do an immediate search, but she's probably not going to be able to search the entire library. And so then the other horrible thought is, did someone steal it? And if so, what kind of security did they have in place? Well, talk to us about Liesl, because, you're relatively young. Why did you decide to pick a middle-aged, or well, let's call her middle-aged, because in my view, anybody under 70 is middle-aged. So I think of myself still as middle-aged, and I'm even older than that. So why did you decide to make an older woman the focal point of your slate of characters?
I just thought that's a really interesting type of character. When I think about women in fiction, the sort of the two life stages that I think are the most interesting when you represent them are women who are sort of in that coming of age period, let's say between 15 to 25, not necessarily because they're having the most interesting experiences, but because they feel their feelings very deeply. So that's interesting to explore. And then women who have life experience. So when you think about a character like Liesl, who I don't think I ever give her exact age. She's old enough that she could feasibly retire. Has a child who's in college, in university. But, this is a woman who has, through her life, she's loved, she's made mistakes. She has long relationships with her coworkers that have undergone different phases in the time that she's been with them. There's just so much life experience that she's had that's going to inform the way that she reacts to situations, that's going to inform the way that she goes about trying to navigate this problem. So I was really interested in the idea of exploring a mystery through the eyes of a woman who's in this stage of her life. And then additionally, for a long time, the women in my life who are in that phase of their life, and not always women in my life, sometimes just women I encountered, maybe, in the fitting room of a clothing store or something like that, would make these jokes about being invisible at that stage of their lives, like, oh, trying on dress, so it doesn't matter, no one looks at me anyway. Like, this was a thing, usually joking, but that I had heard for a really long time, and I just found that fascinating. And that was something that I really wanted to explore too, being made to feel invisible as you get older, and how you could, as a character, maybe reclaim that invisibility and use it, almost use it to your advantage. Because if you're in the position of trying to solve a crime or understand people's motivations, I think, a result of that invisibility is sometimes maybe your intelligence is undervalued. Sometimes, when you're not being asked your opinion in a room, you get to really observe how other people are acting, what their motivations are. So I wanted to reclaim that invisibility for Liesel, while getting to sort of write it and think about it for myself. But I don't know, I've always loved women characters in that phase of life. I wish there was more fiction about them. I just think it's there's so much there to explore.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what you choose to write about when you yourself get to that phase of life.
Yeah.
No, I'm serious. It is indeed. Many women do think that they become less powerful, less visible. I don't know how much that's tied to how we look, or how much that's tied to how we act, whether we think we have power, whether we don't. It's been a non-issue for me. So, it's hard for me to kind of grasp it. The only time I ever really felt invisible was my 17-year-old daughter and I were walking down the streets in New York. And I must have been in my 40s at that point. Susan is a really beautiful girl. And I recognized as we were walking down the street that indeed I could have been just a pane of glass, but it was just temporary kind of a thing. And I don't think I really thought about it much after that. But when I read your book, it gave me some thought. Also, Liesel's been she's not the director. She has been in a support role all this time, and you're right, it is an advantage for sleuthing if people don't immediately leap on the defensive, or if they underestimate you, or they talk as though you're not in the room, or, whatever it might be. You also had a chance to explore some other kind of classic characters that might be working in the library. In law, we used to call them like backroom lawyers. These were the guys, the real brainiacs and so forth. They were wonderful for writing briefs and all, but you never wanted to let them out in the courtroom, or possibly even to meet with clients. And certainly you've got at least one character in this book that, you wouldn't really want interfacing with the public.
Are you thinking of the character of Dan?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, the denim wearing Discman playing. Yes. Is that the one you're thinking of? Yeah, he's a favorite of mine, Dan, and definitely a classic character that you might have in a workplace or a library. Very passionate about social causes, very distrustful of things like technology, very sort of just grumpy and not great about taking direction, although good at his job, like a valuable part of that team, good at his job. Ultimately, reveals himself to be a little bit of a softie, I think, towards the end, and it reveals that he has the same affection as the other characters do for that collection. But yeah, he was a lot of fun to write. And I think that his relationship with Liesel was fun, because while there were other characters who in the professional sense weren't giving her the respect that she probably deserved as a leader, you got the sense from the character of Dan that actually he probably wouldn't give anyone the respect that they deserved as a leader. So it was maybe a little bit more forgivable for him. But yeah, he was a lot of fun.
What about Francis as a character? He's an interesting guy too.
Yeah, he's one, again, the sort of classic trope, this man who knows a lot about his area of study, you know, brilliant man, longtime librarian, little bit of a background where maybe he used to be in an intelligence service. That's sort of a running joke where, you know, maybe with the wink he'll tell you that he was, you know, a divorcee, a little bit of a Lothario, has one button too many open on a shirt, perhaps on a warm day. And he's one of these characters who's had this really long relationship with Liesel. It's one of the fun things to explore, where you think about these two have worked together for decades. This relationship has gone through a lot of different phases as their lives have been going through their phases. You know, they're married, those marriages maybe are falling apart. They're at times, maybe they have a friendship, maybe other times, maybe it's more than a friendship. And through all of that, you know, through the good of that and the bad, they've had to continue to work together as that relationship has evolved. So I really liked the pairing of those two characters. I do find that for a man who's been in that sort of relationship with her, it is hard for that character to give her as a leader the sort of respect that she would deserve. And that's one of the characters who I think really not talks down to her, but really, I think, underestimates her abilities, even as, you know, he's a character who has a lot of love for her as a person. But even through that, in a professional context, he's not able to, I think, give her the intellectual credit that she deserves.
Well, the person who gives her the least credit in many ways is the university president, because he is constantly, Garber, is that his name?
Yeah.
Because, you know, his big concern is donors and the reputation of the university, and he is willing to sacrifice quite a lot to avoid in any way diminishing the donors' contributions or tarnishing, you know. But I mean, a huge part of his job, in fact, is budgeting and, you know, bringing in funds and so forth, probably to the detriment of other things that he could be focused on, because it's so expensive to run any kind of a big institution.
Yeah, so in some respects, you almost understand where he's coming from. So for anyone listening who obviously hasn't read the book yet, because it's not yet out, he's, you know, when it's revealed that there's a crime, he's really the first one, or the sort of major roadblock to the intervention of law enforcement or things like that, because as soon as you get law enforcement involved, then obviously there's going to be publicity and it's going to put the university in a bad light. And that seems crazy. You know, something priceless is missing from your collection. You should definitely get the police involved, to ask whoever you can for help. But he's really opposed to that. And in some respects, you can almost understand where he's coming from. It is his job to protect the reputation of the university. This probably isn't the way that, you know, you or I would go about doing that, but he thinks that he's doing the best that he absolutely can for the university. And when Liesel is trying to push back on that and saying, no, we need help finding these things, we should absolutely go to the police, that's the right thing to do, he's looking at her like she doesn't know what she's talking about. Because to him, the first and the most important thing is just this reputation, because with the reputation, that brings the donation, and that, you know, continues their ability to be this storied institution. So on the one hand, you know, he's a huge impediment to her trying to do what she needs to the solving of this crime. But on the other hand, you can see where he's coming from. And he's right, you know, when they do eventually go to the police, that does attract a lot of negative attention. So he's not wrong in what he's saying the consequences might be, even though he is ultimately wrong, because they definitely should have involved the police much more quickly than they did.
How useful for, you know, I mean, you can't reasonably have Liesel largely leading the investigation here if in fact they called the police in the first place. You know, so I mean, from a narrative structure standpoint,
yeah, useful for my purposes.
He's really helpful. Otherwise, you know, she would have been turning it over. So on page 46, you know, we hear about this Plantin polyglot Bible, but on page 46, what we learn is that it was bound in the 18th century, rebound, because lots of times rare books have, multiple bindings, or at least one or two, in a red Morocco binding, which would have made it quite visible, Morocco leather, bright red, whatever it is. And that, might make it easier to find it if it were sitting, on some shelf where it didn't belong. I mean, one of the things, you've got librarians who have language specialties and subject specialists and all the rest of it, but they're not generally pushing book carts around in the stacks, putting books on shelves. And, the people that are doing that are not necessarily going to be paying attention, to what's going, to the quality of the books or whatever it all is. They're just looking for the proper place to. I mean, I can't tell you how often we lose books on the Poison Pen. It's a small bookstore, and I mean, it's unbelievable how often we're all running around going, where is it? Did it make it back into, the return pile because it was damaged? Did we stick it over here on a staff recommendation? Did we decide to do a special display and we only had one copy and it's hiding there? I mean, where is it? And so if you've got multiple people putting things away, so to speak, or pulling them out, you're always going to wind up with the possibility of serious.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes in the library context, maybe sometimes student employee putting things away. You don't know, and there's a lot of moving parts. And I'm sure that lots of the rare book librarians that I've worked with would almost rather if they could, keep a hand on the books they're working on all the time, and they could be the ones, hand deliver it to a spot on the shelf. And if it's requested by a user, that they would be the only one who was allowed to touch it and pull it out and get it for the user. Obviously, that's not feasible. You need lots of people and lots of moving parts to get a place working. But yeah, to your point, the more people, the more hands you have, the more likely it is that something might disappear, that something might go wrong.
And when you're dealing with really old things, I mean, this is not coming into play in the book, but it's so interesting that things, for example, old books, when they were bound with leather, very often the binder way back would take spare paper or whatever you happen to find to hand and use it to pad the boards, the wooden boards of the book before the leather went on. And when a book is sent for rebinding or restoration and taken apart, that's when you find the missing Beethoven manuscript, or, maybe someday the Shakespeare sonnet or whatever it is that nobody has found in a long time. So they're treasures hidden within treasures. The other and sad part is, and there's a really tragic map library disaster where people have sliced out, reproductions of maps or artwork in books or whatever it might be. And so unless you actually fully open a book that you're responsible for in a library, you might not realize that part of it might be missing. Somebody may have. And so that's been a constant over centuries is, what do you do with the thief who doesn't take the whole book, but takes part of the book?
And that's almost more common than the whole book being stolen. When we catalog rare books, part of the job is you have to touch every single page. So you have to go through every single page, and you have to, and you're doing that because you're counting, but you're looking for the plates and things like that. And so often, so often, those exact things that you're talking about will be missing, and the maps will have been cut out, or the plates will have been cut out, or even single figures or images might have been cut out with something like an X-Acto knife sometime in the history of these books that are hundreds of years old. So yeah, to me, that's almost more of a tragedy than a whole book going missing, because if the whole book went missing, you can still believe that it's intact somewhere, and maybe one day it will be recovered. Right. But once you start to slice things apart or take them apart, that'll, there's no restoring that, really.
No,
how are you ever going to bring
those
those pieces back together?
You can't do. I mean, it's one of the tragedies in art theft sometimes too, is that the thieves came in and cut the painting out of the frame or something, and you can't really ever quite restore that. The Isabella Stewart Gardner theft, for example. Yep. We'd all like to believe that those paintings are still intact somewhere. and, someday might be found, like, the Mona Lisa that went missing for a while, but then, then the question is it really still the Mona Lisa, or was there a great forgery that Jonathan Santlofer, who writes for your publisher, wrote a book like that fairly recently? We can't even be sure. So forgery is another, it doesn't come into play in this particular story, but you can do a lot with forgery. Although modern technology is making it harder in many respects for forgers to get away with things, in terms of analyzing paper and ink and all the rest of it.
And while forgery doesn't come into play, I would say reproduction does. I don't want to go into too much in detail because that's a little bit of a spoiler. But to your point, modern technology is making that more and more difficult. So I think that we're going to probably over the next 10, 15 years, we're going to learn a lot about what's real and what isn't in these beloved collections. That we've heard so much about, but it's also going to make it a lot more difficult for the forgers to get things past. And that's that's sort of the funny thing about when people steal things or make forgeries of things. It's so hard to do anything with that now. It's not like there's a lot of money in this. Now if you were to steal like a piece of art or a rare book, or if you were to try to forge something, there's so much control in the market right now that it would almost, it's necessarily a crime of passion now. It's really, if you're stealing a piece of art, or if you're stealing a rare book, you have to be doing it just because you want the thing yourself. You can't, if you're thinking at all, sure, occasionally there's going to be smash and grab jobs, but those I think are the minority of cases. In the majority of cases, if you're taking something, it must be because you love it so deeply that you think that you're the only person who's entitled to it, and you want to be in its presence all the time. You want it in your home, in your library. That's really the only explanation, because the networks of booksellers are so tight. The same thing in the art market. The research into provenance is so detailed now that if you were to steal something, who are you going to sell it to?
Right. Well, there are now international databases. It's
exactly.
the same thing with serial killers. It used to be they could get away a lot more easily, but now that we have registration, we found, DNA and DNA registration bases, the Golden Gate Killer, that kind of thing. It's actually playing hell with a lot of great mystery plots. It makes it hard. But that's a real question in regard to this Bible is, if somebody has taken it, why? Could it be sold? What would happen? I've run across a really interesting term. You might have seen it. In fact, it's the title of a new book published by Soho. It's called bibliolepsy. And, there is I think a kind of madness that can overcome people in, when they're working in an environment like a rare books library, where indeed, you lose perspective, and maybe you do think that you're the only guardian of this treasure, or you just are intoxicated, by the thought of being around it. There's, many interesting psychological conditions that can arise. One of the things I liked about Liesl, going off on a totally different topic, is that, she has a long-term marriage. And I like her husband. He's very supportive, and especially towards the end of the book when Liesl has to make some professional decisions. I really like I like his role. So I'm glad that you gave her a strong marriage and and a supportive husband, because often in crime fiction you have all dysfunctional people, or really bad relationships and so forth. It's very nice to read about a woman who's in a tough place and trying to, work her way through it, but she has great support at home.
Yeah, it's so funny. The early readers who have read the book, John is, I think, the character who people have responded to almost more than anyone. John, the character of Liesl's husband, which surprised me. I wanted to write a man who was kind and a good, supportive marriage, but it really has struck people. And through their marriage hasn't been without its complications. He's had mental health struggles through their life that have sort of are better at sometimes worse. At other times, often through their marriage, she's had to take on the role of a caretaker for him. And there can be resentments and things like that when you have to take that role. But I wanted to make it really clear in the book that just because he's been ill, or just because life hasn't been perfect throughout their marriage, that doesn't mean that he's the weaker party in their marriage, or that there's a power imbalance. And actually, when we meet them, now at the stage when they've been married for so long, he's really the caretaker of her in a lot of ways. He's the one making sure that she's had a meal that day. If she's maybe, being too overwhelmed with work, he's the one who's giving her sort of really valuable professional advice, or just making her a cup of tea when she needs it. So I did really like showing them at that point in their marriage, but making it clear that they've walked a long road together, and it's been there have been complications, as there are in all real marriages. So yeah, that was a real joy to write, and it's been really lovely to see how people are responding to that character.
So we talked about the polyglot Bible, the Plantin Polyglot Bible, the expensive one that's gone missing. But let's talk about the Peshawar, because that's a really interesting creation. Is there something similar to that you have encountered, or is that something you've made up?
Oh, no, I didn't make that up. That is very much a real thing. Is in the collection of, I believe, the Bodleian. I could be wrong. No, I believe it is. And that was, that the story of that object is so fascinating that I couldn't have made it up. So I basically repeat its story in the book, where about 120 years ago or something, a tenant farmer in Peshawar was digging up a field for farming, and he came across this manuscript. And the manuscript is, later researchers found that it's the first use of the zero in mathematics that we have on written record. So the farmer finds this thing, and he knows enough to know that it's something that shouldn't be discarded, that it's probably something important. So he shows it to, I think, his landlord, and the landlord writes something to a university in India. And so they get interested, and then somebody from Oxford gets involved, and eventually Oxford acquires the thing. So it's in Oxford's collection. And just like I wrote in the book, there's some wonderful photographs and research that's done on this material, I think around the 1910s, but then the leaves are bound in mica. And that is a terrible tragedy, because that is then reacting with the natural material and making it darker and making it fall apart. And they did actually, in real life at Oxford, they did carbon date the manuscript for the same reasons they do in my book, because they want to know, well, actually, like how old is this? How far back do we have record of the zero? How can we say it's the earliest recorded use? And while, the results of that carbon dating are where my story diverges from the original, but even in the original tale, there's a series of academic papers, and academic papers, that's the driest reading you could ever do. They're never interesting, but these are, because there's a little bit of contention about the results of this carbon dating, and you can hear in this dry academic prose the various teams of researchers getting quite snippy with one another about what they believe this carbon dating is telling them. So really, this object has had such a fascinating life, and the object itself is fascinating for what it tells us about mathematics. But it's really, it was a lot of fun to be able to write those things in. And I hope that readers who are interested in rare books, I encourage you to go and Google some of these manuscripts, because they're all real manuscripts in the book. And I could only include, the details that I thought were useful for the plot. As much as I would have wanted to put in more and more and more, there's a lot there for readers to go on their own journey of discovery, and you can look at things like auction catalogs and things like that, and it's a lot of fun to read about some of these manuscripts.
And fortunately, today, many of these manuscripts and books and so forth have been digitized. And so, you might never, for example, like me, queue up in Dublin to, stand in line and look at the book of Kells, and in fact, all you can actually see of it is like the page, 2 pages that are open through this much glass in the whole bit. Or, you can go and look at the digital version of it, which is marvelous and allows, and also the new various improvements in X-ray technology. I think it's even got a fancier name now. They found scrolls in Herculaneum, I think it is, maybe in Pompeii too, but in Herculaneum, that they may be able to, eventually read the contents, even though the
even
eruption
though
of
they can't.
Vesuvius,
Oh, wow.
destroyed it. I mean, they have a better shot at, because scrolls, were before the codex, i.e. a book bound like this, the books or manuscripts were generally scrolls, and they were wrapped up.
Yeah.
And that gave them some protection in time, like when Vesuvius went off in fire and so forth. The Dead Sea Scrolls, survived. But the problem is that if you unroll the scroll, of course, you're going to, damage it, or you may fall apart or whatever it might be. But because of these interesting technologies that have been developed, we may be able to eventually find many a lost work, which, would be fabulous. I mean, if you look back all the way back to Greece and, Egypt and so forth, there's so much that's missing that we might, in fact, one day get to discover. So the crime fiction has always loved bibliomysteries. I'm looking across the room at my bookshelf here in my office, and Otto Pinsler, who is really an authority on rare books in the mystery world in particular, has done a whole compendium of bibliomysteries. And, it's kind of like treasure hunts and so forth. But people who love books are often completely fascinated and love to read books about books, and there's, because of forgery and, will contests or, law. I mean, there's so many different plots that a valuable object like a book, but there's also a kind of a magical quality sometimes to a book. If books can change lives, which is the slogan of your publisher, oftentimes they almost acquire a kind of magical aura or something, so I think crime readers are always completely fascinated with this kind of a mystery. I do have to ask you, but is this isn't a book that demands an immediate sequel, at least not to me. I'm not saying you couldn't go on with these characters, but would you?
There's no immediate plans, and I don't think that it demands an immediate sequel. I think that if I were ever to re-enter this world, it probably wouldn't be after the events in this book. It would probably be before, because there is a hint that what is going on in the book has been going on for quite some time. There are likely other characters who have spent time in the library over these decades that we didn't get to meet. So it is possible that there's more there, but I think that I would actually be interested in exploring the before versus the after.
I think that's a really thoughtful conclusion on your part. And, since you could almost focus, I mean, this book is so much focused on this one Bible. You could almost, do other books focused on some other particular treasure, because let's face it, each one of them would have its own journey. If it were missing, or if it were a forgery, or all the other things that were possible.
Exactly.
So I suppose you could do it that way. What does interest you? I mean, now that you've published this book, what interests you as a new project? Because it's rare that anybody writes just one book and that's it. I mean, we have To Kill a Mockingbird, we have Gone with the Wind, but those are exceptions more than they are the rule.
So actually, what's interesting me really deeply right now is the spy genre. I read just a little snippet in a newspaper. I don't know what I was researching, but a newspaper from the 1980s about a man who, I can't remember where he lived, somewhere in the Midwest, that one day just walked out of his house, left a post-it note on his lawnmower saying that he was leaving and not coming back. And the next time they heard from him, he was somewhere in Nicaragua, where he'd gotten on a bus, and the bus happened to be full of a traveling group of Russian ballet dancers who were there on a cultural exchange. And then he sort of begged to become a spy for them. And because they were a traveling group of Russians, they had their sort of Soviet handlers. So he became a spy for them, but a sort of hapless one, and then tried to become a double agent for the Americans. And then eventually he was caught and it all fell apart. And it was really just, this was in a, maybe 200-word little newspaper article, but he seemed like an interesting, that seemed like the interesting basis for a story. So I thought, I'm thinking about spinning that into something bigger. That's sort of where my mind is right now, in South America with Russian ballet dancers, and just thinking about that post-it on the lawnmower.
Well, I love the spy genre. Actually, I'll send you a link to two of the best contemporary spy novel writers, Charles Cumming and Joseph Cannon. We did an event a couple of weeks ago, and
I would love
some
that.
length about spy fiction. So I'll send you a link to that. You can watch it as a video program, because I think it's a fascinating era. And, there's some of the same questions that we've just been discussing apply to spy, why people spy.
Mm-hmm.
And, the payoffs can be so varied, and the story's so entirely different. I think it's a fascinating. And who can you trust? I mean, that's a big question you explore in this book, is trust, which we didn't even touch upon. But, if you're working with rare and expensive objects, how much can you trust the other people that you are working with?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a huge amount of trust that has to go into that as a work. Like we said, you can't really put anything on the physical objects of the books that's going to protect them. You can't put even, the various stickers you put in regular library books that are going to set off an alarm. You can't do that. So you can have a lot of security from the outside world to protect your collection. But for the people who work there, you're really reliant on the trust of those people, on, how much you can trust those people to protect those materials. And that's tricky.
It certainly is. And in your book, it definitely
is.
Yeah, Patrick, come join us and tell us if you have any comments or questions you'd like to make.
It is a gentle madness, isn't it? Isn't that what they call it? Well, it's funny. You've asked, Barbara, most of the questions that have come in.
Good. I'm going to walk across the room and get Otto's bibliomystery thing down and see if there's anything I want to say while you talk to her for just a second.
Okay. All right. So who do you like in the spy genre? Who are some of your favorites?
I mean, I'm pretty boring. I like my John le Carré and all those. I know that that's not the most interesting answer in the world, but you know what?
Might as well go to the best, right?
Yeah. And then for a long time, I was really resistant to reading any Graham Greene, just because some of the men in my life have always really loved Graham Greene. So I was resistant to the idea. But then I just, since I've been thinking about this book, started reading some Graham Greene. You know what?
Fantastic.
There's a reason people love him so much.
Yeah, he seems like he was probably a pretty miserable human being.
Yes.
But what a great writer.
Yeah, I started reading some spy biographies also, and then Graham Greene comes up in them. There's a story of somebody taking being on a ship somewhere, going to Africa and encountering Graham Greene and him running around trying to get prophylactics for them on the ship. So he's coming up in those little stories too.
I found Otto's book, and I'm mistaken in that this is a collection of bibliomysteries specifically written for the Mysterious Bookshop by writers. But here's a list of very well-known authors who have written small bibliomysteries just because they're so fascinated with it. Peter Lovesey, Lindsay Fay, Bradford Morrow, R.L. Stein, Joyce Carol Oates, Thomas Perry, Elizabeth George, Carolyn Hart, Megan Abbott, Stephen Hunter, Denise Mina, James Grady, Ian Rankin, and James W. Hall. So you can see that, their assignment was to write a mystery that has to do with rare books or special collections or whatever. So you can see what a varied group of writers are, inspired to do something like that, whether it's, even spy fiction, where you've got coding and, documents and all the rest of it. The possibilities are just endless. Is there specific questions, Patrick, or did we kind of breeze through them all?
I think we've addressed them. I mean, one of them that that kept coming up was, are you going to write a sequel to it? And you've already talked about that. Let's see, anything else? Okay, let's see, Larissa, she writes, thank you for this stimulating and informative discussion. I'm so looking forward to reading this book, which I've ordered from the Toronto Public Library.
Oh, a local. Hi, Larissa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She says, I adore the spy genre. Soviet ballet dancers, indeed. How about the USSR Cuba connection?
Wow.
Yeah, that would certainly be something interesting to explore.
It would.
Yeah.
Let's see here. That's about it, really. I think we've covered just about everything.
So, Eva, is there anything you'd like to ask us?
I guess I would be curious because you all are the experts. What are you reading right now, or what books that are coming out this season are you most excited about? Because I already have some recommendations that I'm going to have to go back and rewatch this and write down for myself. But what else are you reading right now that I should be excited about?
Oh, Lord, some days we do 3 of these.
Right. But you must have favorites.
I have one to bring up, which is also a really terrific biblio-mystery. It's by Sarah Gran, and it's called The Book of the Most Precious Substance.
Right.
It's an incredible book. Yeah, we're going to be talking.
I'm going to recommend tomorrow at noon. I'm going to be talking to Janice Hallett, it's another debut mystery. She's a British author. It was the #1 bestseller in the UK, but now appearing here. And the whole thing is constructed, the general conceit of it is that it's a legal brief, and a lawyer has set 2 of his juniors to reading through the enormous amount of material that have gone into to see if the right person is sitting in prison or if there has been a miscarriage of justice. And it's absolutely fascinating because it's all presented in documents and emails and so forth. And so you, the reader, have to sift through it all as you go. And it's an extremely complicated plot, but I found it to be fascinating. So that's a book I can really recommend this month.
That sounds really interesting.
Well, I mean, it's different without being contrived. I mean, sometimes when you read something different, it feels very forced or, but this book does not. I'm really looking forward to talking to her. I just looked at March, and there's something like in our database alone, 107 books we need to look at. The pandemic has brought forth lots more readers than, or lots of people back to reading, let me put it that way, but an awful lot of people to writing. And so I feel like the whole universe of books is suddenly expanding, and it's getting harder to manage it every month. They're just so many.
I got another recommendation, which is this book called One Shot Harry by Gary Phillips.
Oh, I love the cover.
Yeah, it's being published by Soho Press. It's about a African-American photographer in 1963 LA. He covers, all kinds of different things and gets involved. And Martin Luther King comes to town, and really terrific historical.
And if you want to read a spy novel, I think it's called The Berlin Exchange, Joseph Cannon's new book. But if you've never read Joseph Cannon, you should go back and read your way through his work. Charles Cummings' new book, Box 88, is really wonderful. Mick Herron, many people view him as the new John le Carré. He has a new book. I just got an advanced reading copy of it coming out. So, every month has got a wealth of, really just a wealth of treasures. The harder part is to winnow it down. But the great thing for readers is books are, not like cheese. They're like wine. They can sit on your shelf and
exactly
just age wonderfully well.
The right
and
time.
I think real readers don't feel secure unless they have several Because you never know what book you want to read at one moment. We're all in different moods with different energy levels, and on any one day or any hour of one day, one book looks more appealing than another.
Yeah.
Probably find that. And, the curse of being a librarian or a bookseller is that you're surrounded by things you want to read, but you just don't have time.
Yeah.
Very hard. Anyway, it's really been a pleasure to talk to you, Eva. Thank you so very much. For those of you who are interested, we have sold out, but we have reordered. Department of Rare Books and Special Collections, and I will hope that the publisher still has more book plates that.
Great cover
we
design.
would have had her sign her book because she's in Toronto, and books don't move easily back and forth across the border from the US to Canada. There are tax issues and all. We couldn't ask Eva to actually sign the book, but book plates are great.
I believe that FedEx is bringing me more book plates to sign tomorrow, so there should be more.
Oh, splendid. Okay,
So,
well, we can coordinate that, then that'll be wonderful.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you all for spending time with us this evening, and thank you for spending time with us. These are your official publication dates tomorrow, isn't it?
Tomorrow, yeah. And thank you so
Tomorrow.
much for having me on my publication
No,
leave.
it's a
Congratulations.
great pleasure. We've really enjoyed it and wish you all kinds of luck. And I will send you the link to the spy fiction thing because
Wonderful. Thank you.
Enjoy it. Okay. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.